The executive in the UK, or what's sometimes known as the government, is the branch of the constitution that is responsible for forming policy, implementing policy, and also proposing legislation to Parliament and seeking authorisation for raising and spending money from Parliament. Those are its key functions. The executive itself is not directly elected and is actually formed out of Parliament. What's most important is that it has the support of the House of Commons, out of which the Prime Minister by convention is drawn, normally the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons. So that's the system of parliamentary government. It differs from other systems like, for instance, the United States, where the executive, the president and the head of the executive is directly elected by the whole population or by the whole electorate. We don't do that. We have indirect election in effect. The public elect the House of Commons, which is the dominant chamber in Parliament, and then a government's formed because it's got the support of the House of Commons to its existence, and ministers by convention, not by law, drawn from one or other of the two houses of Parliament. Most ministers come from the House of Commons, but some significant ministers can also come from the House of Lords. And the Prime Minister, every Prime Minister since 1902 has sat, or if they weren't already in the House of Commons, has moved very quickly to the House of Commons upon becoming Prime Minister. The senior ministers within the government, Prime Minister is the most senior one, but there are other senior ones like the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the various Secretaries of State, the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, Education Secretary, and so on. Normally in the low 20s, the number of most senior ministers who make up an entity called the Cabinet. The Cabinet is the most important body within the government. It takes decisions as a group, collectively, that bind the whole of the government. So all ministers in the government are bound by its decisions, whether or not they're actually present when that decision was made, whatever their private views may be, whatever position they took during discussions. If they're in the discussion, once the decision's reached, and it's normally the Prime Minister, or if it's a Cabinet subcommittee, the chair of that subcommittee, who interprets the decision. Once that decision's reached, everybody's bound by it, and that's what we call collective responsibility. There are limited circumstances in which, and very limited these are, in which people are given the option of disagreeing with that decision publicly, but normally the basic principle of what we call collective responsibility is that everybody in the government who's a minister has to publicly, at the very least, not disagree publicly with the decision, and in many instances may have to actually actively promote that decision and advocate that decision. And if they can't do that, then they're expected to leave the government, i.e. resign and cease to be a minister. That's the basic principle of collective responsibility, and that's key to the way in which government functions in the UK. Obviously, there are circumstances in which ministers somehow let it leak out into the public, perhaps through anonymous briefing of journalists, that they don't agree with something, but they can't do that officially and avow it without going. So that's one half of what we call ministerial responsibility, the collective responsibility of ministers as members of Cabinet. The Cabinet, this body that determines things as a group, not by the Prime Minister acting alone, but as a group. That's the constitutional position, but it's the reality we'll come back to. The other half of ministerial responsibility is individual ministerial responsibility. So they were collectively responsible as a group for decisions, but also each individual senior minister answers to Parliament for their decisions, policies, and the actions of those within their department. They are personally responsible to Parliament for all those things that go on, the decisions they reach, and they answer to Parliament for them, whether it's in debates, whether it's in questions, written questions, or oral questions, and maybe appearing before select committees as well. They're required to do all those things to actually give an account by themselves for what happens. So those are the two sides to ministerial responsibility. When we talk about a lot of these things, as we've said elsewhere, there's no codified or written constitution in the UK, and all of these principles I've just been describing have very little hard legal existence. they're actually mainly founded in conventions. For instance, the existence of cabinet itself has barely any basis in law at all. It's just something that's grown up over time, become very important, but doesn't have a hard legal existence. There are, however, various rules, like the one I described about collective responsibility, that are built up over time, and a lot of these rules are now set out in publicly available documents, the most famous of which is probably the Ministerial Code, which dates back in some ways to documents that existed from about 100 years ago, but it was only the Ministerial Code was first published under a different name and made available to the public in 1992. That's got some important rules. For instance, the rule that ministers should not mislead Parliament. They should be truthful to Parliament, and that if they deliberately mislead Parliament, they're expected to resign. That's an important rule, and it's there in the Ministerial Code. There are various other rules in the Ministerial Code. However, the Ministerial Code doesn't have a hard legal status, and it's not clear in the end what happens if a Prime Minister or Minister doesn't want to follow what's in the Ministerial Code, decides to break it, or if they're found breaking it, what happens next is not as clear, and in the end it's hard to actually fully enforce the Ministerial Code because it rests in convention, not in clear legal force. But that's not to say it's not an important document, just it doesn't have this firm status. When we think about all of that system and how the executive and ministers and their responsibility works, an important debate that's been going on actually for many, many decades or even centuries is around the idea that yes, in theory, governments run collectively, ministers take decisions as a group, but some people have long argued that in practice, the Prime Minister, certainly the most well-known, in many ways the most important member of the government, some people argue that actually the Prime Minister is the one who's really in charge, and the Cabinet, although in theory it takes decisions as a group, is more of a rubber stamp for the views of the Prime Minister of the day, who after all gets to decide who are the ministers, gets to set the agenda of Cabinet and determine what it will discuss, and also gets to interpret its decisions, and has many other powers as well. Some people argue the reality then is that the Prime Minister is in charge, not the collective. However, there's also a counter-argument that says, although the Prime Minister can be very important, they do have significant powers, they can't govern alone, and they are dependent on other ministers. Other ministers are significant either individually or as a group, and the Prime Minister simply doesn't have that kind of power. And at times they may appear to be very powerful, but that power can also drain away because of political circumstances. And some Prime Ministers don't want to dominate. So there's been an ongoing argument about that, but that's worth bearing in mind. And it reminds us that there's sometimes a discussion about how far constitutional theory matches up with constitutional reality.